You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. Tosh Berman grew up in Los Angeles with famous bohemian artist parents, Wallace and Shirley Berman. Wally and Shirley, as they were known by their friends, were one of the central couples that connected the dots of LA's underground worlds of art, literature, and music. And Tosh had an unvarnished front and center seat to these swirling countercultures through his father's death at 50 in 1976 in a car accident. Tosh recently published a memoir entitled Tosh, Growing Up in Wallace Berman's World. Berman and I sat down earlier this year to discuss his new book, published by City Lights. Here's Tosh Berman.
I wrote it as one large narrative from the beginning of before my birth to my birth and then to my father's death.
So you did do a formal structure. You sat yourself down and just wrote it out like longhand, presumably, or maybe you typed it and...
Both.
Okay.
Because I was traveling around at the time. I was writing this book. I was in Japan. I was in Paris. I was a little bit in New York, a little bit of Detroit. So most of the cases I had my laptop with me, but specifically in Japan, at the time, internet access was not easy to obtain in Japan, so I used my notebook a lot.
Now, did you know that you were going to place this book with City Lights, or had you already contracted the book, or had you just written it sort of serendipitously yourself and then, decided, okay, now I need to find a publisher?
I needed to find a publisher. But the first publisher I approached was City Lights.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This is kind of embarrassing because I've always heard people talking about, I had to write numerous drafts, and my agent tried to put it on one publisher and they didn't take it. But I just basically made a phone call.
Okay.
So it's almost like a Hollywood 1930s dream.
It is a 1930s dream. I think while we're on the subject of this, you mentioned the book cover. It almost looks like an issue of the magazine Semina.
Yes.
And the picture is incredible. Your mother's kind of framed in the background. Mm-hmm. And you had told me before, and I just wanted you to reiterate this story, that you yourself had not actually thought of this as the cover per se, and that City Lights had approached you and said, well, we think this is the strong image here.
Yes, and they're correct, because actually it really describes the relationship between my father, my mother, and me. And I never saw it that way. I just took it face value. But it's kind of an interesting photograph because it's me and my dad surrendering. Our hands are up, and my dad is facing the camera, and I'm facing my father as a little boy looking up to my father. And then there's a picture of my mom in the background looking sort of down at my father as well. And that pretty much describes the structure of the family at the time.
This was early 60s, if I remember correctly, and
this 50s.
This is 50s. Okay.
Yeah, it was probably 59.
So this is right after you guys had left LA because of the sort of persecution that Wally suffered, both at the Ferris Gallery, and I think just the overall vibe here at the time was pretty bad.
Yeah, and San Francisco at the time, because that was taken in Larkspur, which is a community...
That upstate in Marin.
Yes, and the picture is taken actually in my dad's gallery, the Semina Gallery, which was either a burnt-out building or just a structure that's been rotted by nature over the years. And it was just like holes everywhere and just no ceiling, nothing, just barely a structure, if anything. And my dad thought, this is a perfect place for a pop-up gallery.
Yeah.
We didn't call it a pop-up gallery at the time. But my dad but George Herms, who was an artist, that was his first exhibition, and also showed Edmund Teskey's photographs, was Charles Britton's photograph.
You mentioned early on in the book, when you have one of the early chapters about your mother, where you say, at best, women were expected to be the backup in case the male fell apart. In the world of the beats, if you were a woman and not an artist or a writer, you tended to be treated as an individual who supported the male author, artist, who was supposed to keep the home intact, etc., cook the meals. I thought that was really bold of you. And I think you very clearly in that chapter kind of break down the reality of how things were, which a lot of stuff glosses over that.
One of the things that bugged me, specifically a lot of the poets from the Venice Beach era in the 60s and sometimes the 70s, was using a woman as a muse for their poetry. On one side, it seems like such a romantic notion, and it seems perfectly why not, that romantic notion. But it always strikes me as being totally wrong. I think it's wrong to set a type of gender person or a woman to be your muse. The truth is, you're the one doing the work. Whoever's doing the writing is doing the work. Whatever you're projecting on somebody else, that's just projection. So I could say very much I'm influenced by my mother, or influenced by my wife, or influenced by a lover or girlfriend. But the fact is, as the artist, I'm doing the work. And I've never felt comfortable about artists who claim they've got something from the spirit or from the sky or from a woman or from a relationship, unless they're being paid or that woman or boyfriend is actually paying your meals as you're writing, the physical aspect. But the whole muse thing strikes me as being very sexist. My dad's credit, he never used the muse image. He never used my mom as the muse. Other people thought of that.
You mean with respect to like putting her on the cover of the magazine or something?
Yeah, I don't think I meant to be amused. I think it's because my mom is a really beautiful woman, and she has a very strong presence. I mean, she's a very, very charismatic person. That's why she's on the cover. But on the other hand, my mother and other women of that generation was mostly there to serve the male in different cultures of that time, societies, as well as in the beat art world, where she supported my father financially as well. She had to go to work, and she had to, when she got home, she had to cook the meals and stuff and clean the house. And if there was guests at our house, she would have to serve the drinks, serve the food. She was basically a servant. And my mom was definitely not a unique position. Other women that I knew at the time were definitely in the same role. They were definitely in the same category as my mom. They were there to serve the artist, serve the food, serve the drinks, and where the male is definitely the most prominent thing there, which is totally a myth. So there's nothing. So the so-called straight world and the so-called beat or alternative culture world is not a big difference, I think, for a woman. They basically have to serve the master. Whether it's somebody with a crew cut or somebody with a long beard or haircut, it's still the male master they had to serve.
I knew who you were without connecting you at all with your last name for years because you worked at Book Soup. And then prior to that, you worked at Licorice Pizza and also Beyond Baroque. And so you've had this history of, working in a vital role in some pretty legendary places that have helped promote culture here.
Well, again, it goes back to my father. All roads lead back to my family. I was raised not to go to work. I didn't know how to get a job if my life depended on it. And I was never like my father never said, well, son, time for you, you're 16, you got to get a job out there, deliver newspapers. That never happened. And I was pretty much encouraged just to hang out with my father till his death when I was 20 or 21 years old. So here I am, 20, 21 years old, never had a job, nothing. I knew nothing about the job market. I knew nothing. I had no schooling to work. My dad did suggest I go to beauty school because in his mind, he thought going to a trade school will be good for me because therefore I will get hired. And it was a very logical thinking on his part for once because my uncle, Donald, was till very recently a very acknowledged hairdresser. So the theory is, of course, I'll get a job with my uncle, I'll be his assistant, and then I'll be a hairdresser, down the line. But I went to beauty school, and I was horrible. They actually threw me out of beauty school because I was just terrible. And so I had no choice except to work at a record store because that's the only thing I knew. I knew records. So I went to the record store, Licorice Pizza in Reseda on Sherman Way. And I said, I filled the application, which I had no history. I'm like a phantom figure at that point. And but the owner, who was total eccentric, Jim, who's still with us, in his greatest eccentricity, he hired me. This dude that he was crazy as I am. And again, crazy people meet other crazy people. And that saved my life, or at least put me into the legit working world where I had to show up at 10 o'clock and I have to do work till like 5 o'clock. I never had that experience before, except for school, like high school and junior high school. So, and you get paid for that. I get paid to talk about music and records, and it was a great job.
From there, you roll into Beyond Baroque.
I went to Beyond Baroque and Bookstore at the same time, and I always had an interest in cinema. In my mind, I thought it would be like the Cinematheque. You get like a room, uncomfortable chairs, bad sound, no air conditioning, this miserable existence. And I thought, this is perfect to show movies in. So it was the height of the VHS revolution, VHS videos. So I chose films at the time that's not on videotape.
So you would have to get the physical film and
16 millimeter.
Wow.
Actually, not a couple blocks away from here, there used to be a place called Budget Films, which had sort of public domain films you can rent. And they had a lot of Godard, a lot of Franju, and they had some Cocteau. And they had some artists, experimental films, so I mostly went to them. Then, as I got more professional, I went to Canyon Films and Filmmakers Co-op. And then I went, then eventually I got films from the Museum of Modern Art. They had a rental film section. And at the same time I was doing that, I was also working at Book Soup, which is and still is a very prominent bookstore on the Sunset Strip. And again, I'm such a weirdo. The owner of the store is a real weirdo who passed away.
We're talking about Glenn.
Glenn Goldman, a very difficult person on one end, but a very, very interesting and overall great personality. I think he was autistic, but nevertheless, he did things his own way. So he hadn't hit out his own logic. So out of his twisted logic, he hired me. Another crazy person hiring another insane person, me. So, I'm a really good worker. If you trust me and you're insane, I will do my job really well. If you look at my record or employment record, I'm not going to do well because I'm a phantom figure. So therefore, I'm a suspicious character and all that sort. So luckily, I met very few people who took a chance on me and hired me, and it was great. And then Tam Tam Books came out of Beyond Baroque in a way because everybody was starting little presses. And I wanted to start a little press, and I found a niche of a writer, Boris Vian, that nobody knew about, but I thought it was totally fascinating personality, and I loved his books. And I actually hired translators to translate the books from French to English, and which is very difficult because you're really just redoing the book again, and it's very expensive to do. But I was so in love with the idea of being a publisher, because in my mind I thought I'd just have lunches with writers and hang out in the afternoon and drink a lot of wine, which is partly true, but then you have to pay the printer, you have to pay the translator.
There's a lot of practical sides to bookmaking for sure.
And that became overwhelming after many years. I still have the press, but I do not publish any new titles at this point.
The origins of the name, it's the Josephine Baker film.
Yeah, the thing is, sort of a long story, but to make it short, Boris Vian wrote a book called I Spit on Your Graves. He wrote it under another name of Vernon Sullivan, who is this fictional black American writer. This is like in the late 40s. And I Spit on Your Graves takes place somewhere in the southern states where a man got hung because he was going out with a white woman, and the victim's brother was a white Negro. He could pass himself as white. So he goes to these small towns and he commits atrocious crimes as revenge against the people who, not the people who actually hung his brother, but people like who had hung his brother. And he's sort of like a combination of the Joker and a mass murderer. And the book, so Vian wrote the book, pretended it's written by this black American writer, and that Vian himself translated the book from English, which doesn't exist, into French. That's how it was sold in France. And at the time, the French took great offense at this American literature is coming onto the French culture, because there was definitely like a right wing or a very conservative aspect, like French only. We don't need this American jazz. We don't need American influence. So Vian became like sort of a victim of this sort of this philosophy in certain French circles. And there was a huge trial, and it became a big scandal. I Spit in Your Grave sold a lot of copies because of this scandal in France. And eventually Beyond had to admit that he himself wrote the book. There's no Vernon Sullivan, Black American writer. He'd never been to America. So the Tam Tam Books ideal came from I Spit in Your Grave because it's a French man making commentary on American pop culture as well as racial culture. And Josephine Baker is a perfect symbol for me in a sense because she's a Black American artist, entertainer, who went to France and made a huge presence in France and Europe. So Tam Tam is based on a film called Princess Tam Tam. That was like her name in this character. So Tam Tam is in honor of the French appreciating American culture and vice versa. And as well as Tam Tam has a rhythm, a beat. It's like, it means it's tom-tom drums. That's what it means, a rhythm. So since I'm a big music lover, as well as Boris Beyond, it was like, for me, a perfect title for a publishing house.
Tosh by Tosh Berman, published by City Lights, is available at your local bookstore or at citylights.com. For our reading this episode, Tosh Berman will read from his self-titled memoir, Tosh.
Hello. This is all regarding me helping my father, Wallace Berman, in his studio around 1965. It's from my book, Tosh. Besides controlling the record player, my studio job was to hold the artwork steady so he could screw the frame onto it. There's one true sign of a Wallace Berman-made frame, the screws on the artwork. If you see these screws, it means he made the frame, and more than likely, I helped him. At this point, I am probably expected to mention how much I love helping my dad frame his works. But the fact is, I hated it. It would take time forever to hammer a nail or work a screw into the frame. I had to hold the art up until my shoulders were about to give out, and then bam, and more little bams to hammer that perfect nail in that perfect place. It made me sad that a particular art collector, the owner of some of my dad's artwork, had the frames removed and replaced with shiny metallic ones. The collector reportedly said, "At last, I found the perfect frame for Berman's artwork." Maybe so, but I went through a lot of boredom and stiff shoulders for those frames, and I like my dad's frames better. That collector is lucky that he changed the frames after my father died. If Wallace were alive, he would never have approved the modification.
Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer Matea Bain, audio engineer Jacob Ross, and senior editor Nick White. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ale Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.